Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the ongoing payment crisis that Russia is now encountering. Now, if I was to do a deal with you, if you were selling something and I agreed to buy it, you'd obviously expect me to turn up with some cash to be able to pay you. That's how the system works. Cash has been around for around 5,000 years since the introduction of the Mesopotamian shekel back 5,000 years ago. So that's how things are done. But if I turned up at your doorstep and said, I don't have any cash, is there any chance I could pay in potatoes or oranges, or maybe give you a bag of rice in exchange for what you're selling? I don't think you'd be too happy with that. You'd probably chase me out of town, because the barter system died thousands and thousands of years ago. However, it's now back up and running in Russia. And Russia has recently agreed to do deals whereby it's actually receiving payments in potatoes and oranges and rice. So in today's video, we'll talk about what's going on, why Russia has had to resort back to the barter system from thousands of years ago in order to undertake trade with other countries. We'll talk about what's going on with the BRICS payment system, because there's been a lot of chat about BRICS, and here's a quick quiz question for you. Can you name the 5 countries involved in BRICS? I'll give you a clue. They begin with B, R, I, C and S. So I'll cover that off in a second if you haven't already got it. But there's been a lot of talk about the BRICS countries coming together and forming their own currency and their own payment system. So I'll have a talk about what's going on with that, why that hasn't happened yet, and whether or not that's about to be announced. We'll also talk about what's going on between Russia and China, because China is also now talking to Russia about barter systems because of the sanctions that are in place that are causing major problems with regards to cash flow. We'll have a look at what's going on with the ruble, because the cash flow issues that are now occurring in Russia are causing the central bank in Russia to be short of funds. They don't have enough cash to be able to do all of the things that they want to do, including supporting the value of the ruble. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is going on right now, what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, and what the implications of this are for the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. I know I've said this before, but I really mean it. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and the effort, and most importantly, the generosity involved in that really does mean a lot to me. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really does tell me that I'm doing something right, that I'm on the right track, and it keeps me motivated to post as many videos as I can. So thanks a lot. Shortly after the invasion of Ukraine started, President Putin came out and said that he wanted to establish the ruble as one of the international trading currencies. He wanted it to be competing with the dollar as the go-to currency that everybody would do business in, and the benchmark currency for a lot of contracts. However, unfortunately for Russia, that hasn't happened, and it now looks like Russia wants to develop the potato as an alternative form of payment, because it's just been announced that Russia has struck a deal with Pakistan to be paid in potatoes, oranges and rice. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. Something that drives me absolutely insane is spam marketing, whether it be spam emails or spam text messages, or the very worst of all, spam phone calls, where people phone you up and try to sell you things that you've got absolutely no interest in buying. Now, the reason why you're hit with so much spam these days is because of data brokers. And this is a huge industry now. Data brokers can take your data when you go online and register for a store card or buy something, and then they can sell your data onto hundreds of different databases. And those databases are then used to hit you with all of the spam. Now, the great news is that if you can find out which databases you're on, you can contact them and have your details deleted. But who's got time to be doing that? Well, the answer to that question is Incogni. Once you sign up with them, they will contact the data brokers and ask for your data to be removed. And as well as cutting out all of those unsolicited phone calls and messages, it will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the fantastic news is that Joe Blog's viewers can get a 60% discount on an annual plan by clicking on the link in the description below. The Russian news agency TASS has announced that Russian companies have established a barter trade system with Pakistan to facilitate economic exchanges without the need for monetary transactions, as they seek to overcome challenges with payments related to Western sanctions on Moscow. The alternative trade arrangement was signed at the first Pakistan-Russia Trade and Investment Forum in Moscow, and the first Russian company to use the mechanism will be Astarta Agro Trading, which will supply Pakistan with Russian chickpeas and lentils in exchange for Pakistani mandarins and rice. Under the terms of the agreement, Russia will export 20,000 tons of chickpeas, while Pakistan will supply an equivalent amount of rice. Another contract stipulates that Russia will send 15,000 tons of chickpeas and 10,000 tons of lentils in exchange for 15,000 tons of mandarins and 10,000 tons of potatoes. According to Nasir Hamid, Pakistan's Deputy Commerce Minister, the barter system was created due to difficulties with mutual payments. While monetary transactions are under increasing scrutiny due to international sanctions against Russia in retaliation for its invasion of Ukraine, barter schemes offer companies a way to circumvent complications by exchanging goods directly rather than involving bank payments. Such deals help avoid attention from monitoring organisations tasked with ensuring compliance with sanctions. And this deal isn't Russia's first exploration of barter trade as a solution to payment issues. In August 2024, it was reported that Russia had been in discussions with China about resuming barter trade, particularly in metals and agricultural products. However, that project has been slow to gain momentum, as individual companies have struggled to meet the specific needs on both sides. However, Russia and China have a history of barter deals, which were common before the Soviet Union collapsed and continued into the 1990s. However, any new barter deals would be the first for over 30 years. In February 2024, Russia's Economy Ministry published a document advising Russian companies how to conduct barter transactions and pointing out pitfalls to avoid. The 15-page document included a step-by-step guide for calculating costs and customs duties, explained the requisite accounting requirements, and provided contract templates for the different kinds of barter trades: bilateral, multilateral, and tolling, where a factory is used as a third party, for example. The document described barter trades as a good way to avoid international settlements and cash. And interestingly, it's not just Russia that are keen on barter deals. China has also been involved in various barter deals over the past few years. In June 2019, it was reported that China had agreed a palm oil barter deal with Malaysia worth in excess of $140 million. Malaysia had agreed to export 1 billion Chinese yuan worth of palm oil, which is the equivalent of around 200,000 tons of palm oil, in exchange for construction services, natural resources products, and civilian and defence equipment from China. And in 2021, it was reported that a Chinese auto parts business exported $2 million worth of auto parts to Iran in exchange for pistachios. So why 2.5 years into the invasion of Ukraine is Russia now having to accept payments in oranges and potatoes? And apologies for the overuse of these props, but I don't use many props in my videos, and now that I've got them out, I just wanted to make the most of them, but I promised to put them away and not to use them anymore in this video. Well, the main reason why Russia is having to do barter deals with Pakistan and other countries like China is because of the tightening of the financial sanctions. Over the last 2.5 years, there have been a wave of sanction. 14 different rounds of sanctions have been applied against Russia. And those sanctions specifically name Russian companies and Russian individuals that are seen to be having an influence on the war in Ukraine. So anybody that deals with those counterparties is at risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. Now, that was more of an implied threat up until June 2024, when the USA issued specific warnings to both Indian and Chinese financial institutions that if they were found to be dealing with any of those counterparts, then their institution would also be hit with sanctions. And what that would mean would be that those institutions wouldn't be able to deal with any businesses in the West. And as I've talked about before, Russia only accounts for around 2% of China's exports. So whilst China is a hugely important trading partner from Russia's point of view, from China's perspective, it's lost in the roundings. It's 2%. So 98% of China's trade is with the rest of the world. And the last thing that China wants to do is run the risk of losing a massive chunk of that 98% just because it's doing some deals with Russia. So the implication of this additional warning in June has been that all of the Chinese and Indian banks and financial institutions have introduced more compliance. So they've got more checks, more regulations, more hurdles, more hoops to jump through before payments can be released. And what that has meant is that over the past 3 or 4 months, all of those payments have been held up. So Russia is now running out of cash because although it's doing the deals, it's agreeing to sell oil and gas and coal and other things to both India and China. It's not actually being paid because the payments are being held up in the system while everybody checks every single name on the list, every shareholder of every company that they're making payments to. So this is a really rigorous process that's been introduced to protect China and India from secondary sanctions. And the problem that Russia has is that it's running short of cash. So one of the ways that it can now make payments is by trading different items. So as we just talked about, it's now exporting things like lentils and chickpeas in exchange for oranges and potatoes. So this really is a throwback to sort of 5,000 years ago before we had any form of monetary system. And I think this is a slight embarrassment from Russia's point of view because, as I mentioned at the start of today's video, immediately following the war in Ukraine, President Putin was hopeful that the ruble would become established as an international trading currency. Everybody would want to use the ruble. But actually what's happened in reality is the opposite of that. Nobody wants to use the ruble, including China and India. They're refusing to do deals in rubles. China will only do deals in its own currency, the Chinese yuan, and India wanted to do deals in its currency, the Indian rupee. However, Russia had no use for all of those rupees. It didn't want to get paid hundreds of millions of dollars in rupees by India for the sale of its oil and then not be able to use those rupees for anything else because Russia doesn't really buy a lot in reverse from India. So as a result of that, Russia is now being paid by India in Chinese yuan and United Arab Emirates dirhams. So it's building up that currency which it can then use to buy things from China or other countries. So the Russian ruble has really fallen away in terms of the prospect of becoming an international currency. And actually, it's now a dead currency. Nobody's using it apart from Russia. And Russia is now having to resort to other forms of payments. And this is obviously going to have a huge impact on the Russian economy because if you're a company, you can't pay your staff in potatoes or oranges. So you might receive in hundreds of thousands or tons of oranges as an exchange for what you've just sold. But you then need to sell those oranges in order to get some cash to be able to pay your bills, your people, and your taxes. So this is bad news for those Russian companies who are doing these barter trades because you don't set up a business to earn a lot of oranges. That's not what your objective is. And also it's bad news for the Russian state because those businesses will have to pay their taxes. That's how Russia gets money from all of the Russian companies. And if those companies actually don't have any cash, if they've got no cash flow, they're having to do trade deals instead, then clearly they won't be able to pay their taxes. So this is a really big problem. And cash flow is now growing to be a huge issue from Russia's point of view. And that's having a direct impact on the value of the ruble. This chart shows the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the past 6 months. And the reason I wanted to look at this range is to talk about what's happened since June, since the tightening of the sanctions were introduced and the Chinese and Indian financial institutions were warned about the secondary sanctions. On June the 19th, $1 US was trading for 83 rubles on the international markets, and that was actually the strongest level that the ruble had traded at in the past 12 months. However, as you can see, between the middle of June and the start of October, there was a rapid decline in the value of the ruble, and today $1 US is trading for more than 95 Russian rubles, which represents a decline in value of more than 14%. And one of the main drivers for the fall in the value of the ruble has been the fact that the Russian central bank is running out of cash and therefore can no longer afford to support the ruble in the international markets. If we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the value of the ruble crashed from around 75 to $1 US to more than 125. And that was as a result of the international outcry against Russia. Lots of companies and institutions came out and said that they no longer wanted to deal with Russia, and therefore they were all selling rubles. So there was a run on the ruble, and the Russian central bank stepped into the market and started buying rubles to support the value. And you can see that there was a remarkable turnaround in the value. And by the end of June 2022, $1 was trading for 51 rubles, which was actually the strongest exchange rate that Russia had seen for more than 7 years. However, supporting a currency in the international markets is an expensive business. It can cost billions of dollars. And as you can see, over the course of the last 2 years, the Russian central bank has reduced its purchasing policy. It hasn't been able to maintain the value of the ruble. And as a result of that, the value of the ruble has fallen. And the rapid fall in the value of the ruble that we've seen over the past 3 months is as a result of the fact that the Russian central bank is now struggling for cash and is struggling therefore to be able to support the value. In addition to the sanctions that are being applied against direct payments to Russia, Russia is also struggling as a result of the fact that it's been excluded from the international payment system called SWIFT, and that's used by most countries around the world, but Russia no longer has access to that system. And interestingly, over the last 2 years, Russia has been talking up providing an alternative to SWIFT, building one with the BRICS nations. And I'll jump back to the question I asked at the beginning of today's video. Can you name the 5 nations in BRICS? Well, they are Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. I think South Africa is probably the trickiest one to get out of those 5. There's actually 5 more countries that have now joined this consortium. They are Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Iran. So it's difficult to put together a 10-letter acronym to cover all of those. So it's BRICS plus, I guess. And the BRICS nations have been talking about putting this system together, and it's being called the BRICS Bridge. However, they are struggling to be able to get something agreed because when you've got 10 nations, all of whom are thinking about their own interests, they want to make sure that whatever gets agreed fits with their agenda. It becomes quite difficult, particularly when you've got the 2 largest countries in the world, China and India, and also Russia, who believe that they should be head of BRICS. So it becomes quite difficult to get an agreement on anything. And before one of the recent meetings, a Russian news outlet reported that the South African ambassador to Russia said that South Africa would prefer an African payment system that provides opportunities for trade with global partners, and it wants to avoid the dominance of any one currency. So clearly getting something that works for everybody is going to be quite challenging. And one of the ideas that's been floated by BRICS is introducing a common currency that all 10 of the countries could use. And the governor of the Russian central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, said, "Of course this idea deserves attention, but I think this project will be quite difficult to implement. Like any idea of a supranational currency, it requires the consent of many parties. This is not a simple project at all. Therefore, we are still working and concentrating our efforts on the development of bilateral settlements using the national currency." So I think we can take it from that Russia aren't really supportive of having a common currency amongst all 10 of these nations. And in fact, I think it's virtually impossible to get all 10 of those countries to agree to one, because it's a bit like the euro when that was introduced in Europe. It was very difficult to be able to set your entry level, which then is fixed for the whole rest of your life. Very difficult to agree where everything's trading, particularly as we've just discussed, the value of the ruble is in the toilet at the moment, so it wouldn't have a very strong position in that common currency. So I don't really think Russia would want to sign up to that at the moment. China probably isn't interested in a new common currency either. It wants to establish the Chinese yuan as the competitor to the dollar. China is doing a lot of trade with Russia and other countries in the Chinese yuan, so it really wouldn't want to create a competing new currency just for the benefit of the other 9 nations. So I think what I'm trying to get across here is the difficulty that all of these countries are going to have. In theory, BRICS is a great idea. It could form a big trading partnership that could be competing with the West. However, getting all of those countries to actually agree to something is very difficult. And I think BRICS may well go on being a concept, an idea that in theory works well, and I'm sure they'll do some trade agreements between each individual country. However, doing something as a collective is far more difficult, and it will be interesting to see who wants to take the lead role. I'm sure Russia does, I'm sure China does, I think India will probably want to do it, and I'm sure Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Iran will also have a lot to say on the matter. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I think the news that Russia is now signing trade deals whereby it's going to be paid in potatoes and oranges is really quite fascinating, and apologies for using the potato and orange props again, but I just couldn't resist it. It tells us that the Russian economy is really struggling right now. The secondary sanctions, which have really tightened in on Russia over the course of the past 3 months, has really cut down Russia's cash flow. It's seriously struggling for cash right now. And the fact that businesses in Russia are signing barter deals going back thousands of years in terms of the development of their business is really quite interesting, because those companies, those Russian businesses, have real costs. They have to pay their staff in cash. They have to pay for all of their energy costs, all of their input costs. Basically, every single cost of that business needs to be paid for either in rubles or dollars or yuan or whatever currency it is that they're having to make payments in. They can't make payments in oranges. It just doesn't work. So accepting 20,000 tons of oranges in exchange for all of the things that you've produced leaves you with a major problem. You then have to convert those oranges into cash. So you have to find somebody else to take the deal, to actually do some trade with you on the back of it. And that's a major problem. And it's probably going to mean that that company doesn't get the full value, because if you're forced to sell 20,000 tons of oranges because that's what you've been delivered, you've obviously got a limited amount of time to do that because they're perishable. It's not like cash where you can just leave it in the bank or just have it in your payment system. You have to do something with these oranges before they start to decay. So you've probably got a week or a month before it starts falling in value. So this represents a major problem for those companies. And it tells us that the sanctions are really starting to hurt the Russian economy. When businesses are doing things that don't involve cash payments, that is a last resort. This is something that you would only do if you're in really desperate situation. And that's exactly what's happening in Russia right now. So it tells us that the secondary sanctions, the stopping of all of those payments from China and India that are going to Russia, are causing problems. And as we saw earlier in the video, it's now having an impact on the value of the ruble, because the Russian central bank isn't receiving as much cash as it was previously. Therefore, it's struggling to be able to support the value of the ruble. So it's now drifting. It's heading back to that 1 to 100 level against the dollar. And what that means from Russia's point of view is that the cost of all of its imports are increasing. So anything that's being imported into Russia that's being paid for in an overseas currency is becoming relatively more expensive for all of the companies and consumers in Russia. So that's pushing up inflation. Inflation being high means that the Russian central bank is having to increase interest rates to bring inflation back down. Increasing interest rates discourages companies and consumers from borrowing because they don't want to pay 25% interest on the money that they're borrowing. And so that's reducing the amount that they're investing back into their businesses. That will reduce the growth of those companies. Therefore, GDP will start to come down. So the overall summary of today's video is the fact that Russia is now being paid in oranges and potatoes tells us that it's running short of cash. Companies in Russia are desperate to do trade deals, so they're having to accept something that's on offer if they can't accept cash. They are going to struggle to be able to make their payments, including their tax payments to the state. That means that the Russian state will have a reducing amount of income. It will therefore won't be able to support the ruble in the international markets, so the value will continue falling. That will push up inflation, which will push up interest rates, all of which is seriously bad news for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking, and you enjoyed seeing these guys. If you did, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.